Hey, welcome back to video 4 for week 9. So now that we've got our exports ready to go, we've exported our stems from our track, including the returns. It's all sounding exactly how we want, and we're ready to get into the nitty-gritty of the mixdown stage. So you can do this whole process inside the project that you made the track in, but I really wanted to show you this way because I think it's really helpful as a producer to lock your track in and then do the mixdown separately. Otherwise, if you try and do the mixdown in your project file, which is, I do it all the time. Sometimes it's just easier for me, but whenever I can, I do train myself to go through this process. That way, I stop tinkering with the track. Otherwise, if I don't export it and don't do the mixdown separately, I'll forever just be sitting there tweaking things and playing around with it when in reality I'm not really changing it that much. And then I end up never doing anything with the track or exporting it or releasing it, because I just spend weeks on end constantly tinkering with the same track. So this is a good technique that you can use once you're happy with how it's sounding. You can just export it, and then you can do the mixdown separately without being distracted by things like, I think this drum needs a 5% more saturation, and maybe I should add a little fill here and there, and then it just goes on, and you have this endless vicious cycle of tweaking your track. So not everyone falls into that habit, but if you do find yourself doing it and you just never release music, this is a great way to kind of lock your track in, and then you can do the mixdown process separately. And if you do want to make any subtle changes, you can do that in here as well. So if you find that something needs a touch more reverb, we can actually just do that in here with the stems. And you always have that option that if you did make a blatant mistake and you have to change something, you can always go back to your project, fix it up, and then export it. But at least this way you're working separately from that project, so you're not going to be distracted by all those things. With that said, let's get started on the mixdown process. So I've got an empty project open here. The first thing you want to make sure of when you start this is that your BPM is exactly the same as what you had your BPM of the track that you made. So make sure you go back and double check what you set the BPM to, and then set it up here so it's the same. So mine was 120, I don't think I changed it at all. What we're going to do now is jump into the arrangement view. And I'm going to delete these MIDI tracks since we aren't using any MIDI instruments at all. We're solely working with audio files now for our mixdown. So just navigate to where you saved out all those stems. So I've got all mine here, including my returns. What we're going to do is just highlight all these stems. Actually, before this, I just have to make sure we have a couple of settings adjusted before we drag these stems in, because it can get quite annoying. So open up your preferences and then just navigate to record warp launch down here. Just click on this. Now where you see warp and fades and it says auto warp long samples, we want this off. Especially if you have quite a few stems, it's going to get very annoying, and Ableton's going to auto warp all those stems. Then you have to go back and adjust them. Whereas we want to just be able to throw in our stems without Ableton messing with them, because we know what the BPM is, and we know that we don't need to adjust them in any way. Feel free to turn this back on if you are using other samples later on in your production. But for this process here, just make sure you turn that off. While we're here, we can also turn off create fades on clip edges. This just makes sure that there's no fading at the beginning and end of our audio tracks. So this section of the preferences is also where you can adjust what the default warp mode is. So if you're sick of Ableton putting on beats every time, you can change this to, let's say, something like complex. That way you don't have to keep going back and changing it. Just depends what kind of files you're working with. But now that we got this set up, we can close our preferences. And then what we can do is navigate to our folder here, drag select over all your stems to make sure you have your folder on top of Ableton like this, so you can see Ableton as well. And we're just going to drag the stems into Ableton. But don't let go yet. Before we let go, we have to hold command. You can see when I hold command there, it changes the view, so it actually lines them up vertically, and it puts them on separate tracks. If I just drop them here like this, it's going to put them all on one track, and we don't want that. So I'm just going to undo that. Then I'm going to grab my stems again, make sure my mouse is right at the beginning of the time range there, and then hold command or control so that they line up vertically, and then let go of the mouse. Now you'll notice that all of the tracks are separate on their own audio track. If we open this up, we can see the names a little better. So just move your mouse to the left here until you get the left closed bracket, and you can adjust this in and out. So now I can see the names and what each instrument is. So if we double check all of our audio tracks, there's no warping, the start is at the beginning, and everything's as it seems. So before we do anything, let's just listen to it. This is the number one thing you should do once you drag your audio tracks in. Just listen to the whole track and make sure everything sounds as it should, because we don't want any of that weird pitch bending going on, or maybe something glitched while exported. It is all possible, so just make sure you listen to it and it sounds exactly as it should. Okay, straight away, I've just noticed my bass is off pitch. So the pitch bend, yeah. I think it stays the same through it. Oh no, there it fixes itself, okay. So if you hear this part here, it corrects itself. I'll just solo this so you can hear it. See how that's a completely different key. And that's why we love Ableton. So I really hope this is something they fix soon. I'm just going to go back and re-export this bass, make sure it's all correct, and then I'll see you when I return. Okay, I'm back. This is the third time I've done this because I fixed it for this part, but then this part started pitching weirdly on its own. So I had to go into my project and then make sure I set automation points on the pitch bend for the start of each bar, just for the start here after this pitch bending happened. That way for the rest it was correct. So it's super annoying. If you are having that issue, you just have to make sure you set pitch bend automation marker at 0 for the start of the clip. And do that for the start, and wherever else it changes, just make sure you do it before and after. That way it doesn't automatically pitch bend itself. Okay, let's continue with the process. So we've got all our tracks in now, and we're ready to get started. So the first thing I'm going to start doing is just grouping some things, just to make it a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to group my returns here. So I'm going to select the first one and then just Control or Command select the next one. So I've got these three here that are my returns. Then I'm going to hit Command G or Control G to group it, and just name this returns group. If your drums are separate, let's say you have a kick, snare, clap, hi-hat, everything all on its own individual track, you can group those as well into a drum group. Same goes for any other instruments. So if you have maybe 2 or 3 different instruments which are quite similar, you can group them as well. So if you have multiple guitars or multiple pianos, make sure you group all those. And because we're doing the mixdown ourselves, we don't have to be as careful with our grouping of the tracks. Once you get later down the line where you might be sending your tracks to someone else to mix down, like a professional mixdown engineer, then they might want you to put your instruments into specific groups. I'm going to put that on screen now, what those groups typically are, just so that you have this as a reference. So your typical groups would be, you'd have your kick, usually it's on its own. Because the kick has low end and high end frequencies, you can't really process that with any other instrument, so it's always good to keep the kick on its own. Next, you can group your snares and your claps together, because they kind of sit in the same range when it comes to EQing. Then we have the hats. If you have different types of hats, you can group them together for sure. Then we have the percussion. So any other percussion that doesn't fit in any of those groups, you can put them in there. Then we have a sub. So if you're working in a genre that has the sub separate to the bass, you'll need to group the sub on its own. But sometimes you can put that with the bass. So it just depends on the engineer themselves. Then we have our synths group. So any synthesizers that you're using for melodies, whatever it might be, you can put them in there. Pads, we group them together. So the background chords, anything that you're using as a pad. Vocals, you can group them together if you have multiple vocal tracks. So next we have FX, which I already grouped mine that are here. So I already grouped my effects together in the project file, and then when I exported them, they all come out together. And then last one is just various instruments. So if it doesn't fit in any of those other categories, you can just put the other random sounds in there. So that's a basic typical guide when it comes to grouping your instruments. You don't have to worry about this as much if you're doing it yourself like we're doing now. So we have most of the things separately. Otherwise I would have grouped maybe the synth lead with the chords, or the flute with the guitar or something like that. But because we're doing the mixdown on our own, I'm happy to leave those separately just in case I need to change them on their own. So we've got all our instruments here. Now that we've fixed up the pitch and we have everything sounding the way we want it, we'll double check that everything's correct. So next step, this is something that's also good practice. Let's shift select all of our tracks and we'll bring them all the way down to negative infinite, so there's no volume at all. What I'm going to do now is drag up each instrument separately until it sounds the way I want it. So this is a good way to reset your ears, and your perception might have changed over time as well of the track. And because you've been listening, I'm sure you've been listening to the same track over and over again, it can affect how you hear it yourself, and you kind of just let things go through because it's already there. Whereas if we force ourselves to bring all the tracks down to nothing and drag each one up separately, that way we have to reevaluate the track, and now that we're coming back to it with fresh ears, we might think differently about some sounds, so we can make sure they're all sitting in the right space. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the drums here and just start bringing this up. I like to have it so that my main kick doesn't really exceed negative 10 decibels. So a quick way for me to check that is just to hit tab to go back to the session view. That way I can see the master. Unfortunately, it doesn't give us what the number is of the volume in here, so we have to use the session view for that. Okay, so we're at negative 10 now for my drums. So I'm going to leave those there. I'm going to go to the next most prominent sound, so I'll go to the bass and I'll just drag this up and start ordering them in that fashion. I'm going to start to bring the bass up now. Might go to the chorus as well. Okay. Now that I've got those two, the drums and the bass, I'm going to start to piece everything else around it. So I'm just going to go through and bring up each volume until I'm happy with how it sounds. So the next thing I might do is the synth lead here. And when you're doing this, try not to focus on these numbers. So if you have to, hide the numbers or just look away from the screen and just use your ears as a guide. And just keep bringing the volume up until it sounds how you want it. So this way you're not focusing on numbers or the decibels or anything like that. You're purely relying on your ears and how the track sounds. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to look away from the screen and bring this up. Okay, so for me it's about there. Next, I'm going to grab these vocal chops because they're quite prominent. Same thing, I'm going to just loop this chorus bit here. Then I'm going to bring these up slowly until they sound how I want them. I'm not going to look at the screen. Okay, so about there. I'm just looking now where I put it. So it's, yeah, quite louder than the rest because for me these vocal chops are the main hook. so they will sit up front for me. Next thing I'm going to do is this synth pluck here. Same process, not looking. Okay, about there for me. It was a little bit lower than what I had it at initially. Then let's do the chords. Okay, about there. Let's do this guitar. Just going to loop this section here where it's just playing. Otherwise I have to listen to all of this to get to the next guitar bit. So looking away. About there. Sounds nice. And then what have we got? So effects. Don't have to do this as much for the effects, but we'll do it anyway. Loop this bit. Alright, so that's sitting nicely for me there. Okay, so I did have it a little bit lower than what I initially outputted it as. And then we'll just do this last flute bit. Might just go back to the intro here because that's where this is most prominent. Right, about there for me. And then the returns, we don't have to do this process for the returns because they're just the wet reverb version, so we can look at the screen while we do this. Bring them up. Let me just solo them to here first. Right, so that's really sitting in the background, so that should be fine there. Okay. So we've gone through and individually brought up the volume of each track to our new refreshed ears and to where it sounds nice to us now. And then just by looking at these numbers, you can see it's completely different to how we actually exported it and how the track sounded before. If we wanted it to sound exactly the same as when we exported it, we would have these all at 0 and it would just be exactly the same. But now that we're coming back to it with a fresh perspective, we've exported the track and we're bringing up the volume separately for each instrument. We're able to come back to the track now and just mix it together so that it might sound better than what it did before. So maybe you had some sounds in your track that were way too in your face that you didn't really notice. And when you actually go through this process and you don't look at the screen and you just listen to the music and you bring up the volume slowly, it can really change your perspective so that you're focusing on what you're hearing rather than what you're seeing. And you might find some big changes in these volume levels that you've actually adjusted to where you had them originally. So for me, they're mostly quite subtle within the sort of 2 decibel range. This one was a little bit lower here. But if you are noticing that when you did this process, you had very big changes, so over 5 decibels, that tells you that you're probably just stuck in your ways with that sound for a long time. You didn't really notice it until you actually just listen to it and come back with a fresh perspective. So this is the first step of the mixdown stage, is to make sure you have all the volumes set correctly. So bring them all down to nothing and then bring each one up until it sounds pleasant to your ears. Make sure you save your project now as well. Once you got that saved, now we can dive into the actual effects and to really cleaning up this track a bit. So the first thing that we can do is just listen out for anything that's bothering us mix-wise. Whether some sounds are clashing, you might have a bass that's clashing with your kick, or some synths are clashing with other instruments or vocals. We can fix that up now, straight away. So for me, I have this kick and this bass here. If I double check this with the EQ, I'm just going to put an EQ on both of these tracks. My kick is peaking at around that 50-ish mark, 50 Hertz. Let's take a look at my bass. So the root of my bass is also around this range here, 50 to 60-ish. What I can do to make sure that these both have space is that I could just come in and EQ one so it's not as prominent in that section as the other. So making the bass a little less heavy for this sub-region, which will give a chance for this kick to punch through. But what I'm going to actually show you is a technique that's called side chaining, and that's really important for when you're trying to get kicks and basses to work together if they're playing on top of each other like I have here. So this is a new technique that I'm introducing to you, and it involves the compressor. So what side chaining is it allows you to use an input source as a trigger for the compressor. So let me demonstrate this so you can understand what I mean. I'm going to loop this section here where the bass and the kick are playing at the same time. I'm going to put a compressor onto the bass track. Now you can't actually see anything here that has anything to do with side chaining. So to get this option, we have to open up our compressor with this little arrow, and now we actually get a side chaining option. So if I turn on side chaining now, we can see this little section activates, so now we can get an audio from somewhere. So to make sure this works, what we can do is grab the audio from our drums. So what this is doing now is taking the signal from our drum track here, piping it into this compressor, and it's using that signal as the activator for the threshold. So this signal that we're getting in here now is not the bass, it's actually the drums. If I turn off side chaining, this is the bass signal. So you can see it's quite constant, and we can tell that just by looking at the waveform, how it's just a consistent line because the bass is consistent through there. If we grab the signal from the drums and turn on side chaining, we're now grabbing this sound instead of the bass sound. But the compressor is actually still on the bass. So we're affecting the bass, but we're grabbing the signal from the drums. Now that we have side chaining activated, what we have to do to start making this affect our bass, the drums affect our bass, is we can bring the threshold down until we can hear it start to work. You can hear now with my threshold down there, I'm getting that pumping effect. So what's happening is that for every input that comes through, so this massive kick is coming straight in, it's activating the threshold, and then the bass is ducking out of the way. So it gives us that pumping and ducking effect. If you make dance music or EDM, you're going to be using this a lot. And honestly, this technique is used in any genre. It's a super handy technique so that you can get one sound to duck out of the way when another sound comes in. You don't have to just use this on kick and bass. You can use it on, let's say, a mix between vocals and instruments, so that you can get the instruments to duck out of the way when a vocal comes in. Or if you have other sounds that are competing for the same space and you want one just to duck in and out depending on when the other one plays, you can use side chaining so that whenever the input signal of the other track happens, this one ducks out of the way. That's essentially what this is doing now. So if I really push this, now it's ducking out of the way for the kick, and it's also slightly ducking out of the way for the hat there. So we just want that kick to really affect it. So I'm just going to bring up the threshold a little bit. And I'm going to turn up the ratio just so it ducks a little bit more. Let me just put this EQ on afterwards. Okay, so if we listen to these two now, we can bring our attack down slightly so that it occurs a little bit quicker, because we want to make sure that this bass ducks out of the way as soon as this kick hits. So what this would look like is if it was in a waveform, there'd be nothing here because it's ducking out of the way, and then it would be slowly rising up until it reaches its normal volume. So I'm not entirely happy with this just yet, because that hat signal that's there is affecting the sidechain as well. So it's giving this weird pumping effect. I just want the kick to make this bass duck out of the way, not this hat signal as well that's coming through. So if we take a look at if we use this view here, we can actually see the compressor working. So that big dip is when the kick is hitting. Now see this other little dip here? That's when the hat's hitting. I don't want that to happen. So I don't want to get rid of the hat here. There's multiple ways that you can do this, but what I'm going to do for this one, I'm actually going to turn on the EQ here. What this is doing is giving you the ability to actually EQ the sidechain signal. So I'm EQing these drums for the compressor only. What I want to do is I just want the low end frequencies to come through, because this hi-hat is in the upper frequencies up here. I don't want that to affect the sidechain. So what I can do is just make the fall off like this and have a low pass filter so that only the kick at the beginning here, only this information is affecting the sidechain. So I'm going to change this EQ to a low pass filter. Let's try 200 Hertz to start with. And there we go. Now only the kick is affecting the compressor. If I turn this off so that the hi-hat affects it as well, we get that weird pumping sound. Especially if I bring the threshold down. It's like a double duck occurring. If I turn on the EQ. Now it's only the kick that's making the bass duck out of the way. I'm going to bring my threshold back up. Make it a little less harsh. And this is a way that you can get certain frequencies from your input signal to affect the compressor. So if you don't, like in my case here, I only wanted the kick to make the bass duck out. I just low passed it so that the hi-hat information wasn't coming through and affecting the compressor as well. That way it just works a lot smoother. Okay, let's listen to how that sounds now. Just unloop this. Just make it a little less harsh there. Okay, so now that bass is ducking out of the way whenever my kick hits. So that's what sidechaining is using another input signal to affect the compressor, whether that be for like a kick and a bass where you want the bass to duck out of the way like this, or for guitars or vocals, whatever it might be. If you want sounds to duck out of the way when the other sound happens, this is how you do it. So hopefully that all makes sense to you. You might have to play around with this just with a few tracks just to make sure that you can wrap your head around it and how it works. And also mess around with the EQ as well to see how you can change the input signal to affect the compressor differently. So this is a very handy technique on all genres. It's obviously most prominent in dance music and EDM, but it can really be applied anywhere, and it should be applied to where you need it. Okay, so I was going to try and fit my mixdown process into this video, but we might actually have to come back in another video and then we'll get started on the rest. So for now, just play around with the compressor. Maybe just try this sidechaining technique and play around with that. Make sure you understand it and how it works. And now that we know this and we have this in our bag, we can move on with the rest of the mixdown process. I'll catch you for video 5 and we'll come back and finish this mixdown off.